Hi everyone. My name is Imran Balodia. I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor for Climate Sustainability and Inequality at Fitchett University. As part of the work that we're trying to promote at Wits around climate change, we have a series of lectures that we call the Pro Vice Chancellors lectures. And what we try to do in this series is to kind of highlight the work of top climate scientists and trying to make their work accessible to the broader public. The kind of ideas to really to kind of bring to the public some of the most interesting and kind of important work that is happening in climate change. And we try to combine some academics and lectures by people who are kind of outside South Africa, but also include some of our most kind of interesting researchers at Wits. And I'm really pleased today that we that we can have Professor Jennifer Fitchett kind of present the lecture today, because kind of Jennifer is kind of really one of our most important, kind of interesting and top academics in the field of climate change. She's a professor of physical geography at the university. Kind of research interests are kind of largely in the field of meteorology, and exploring the impacts of climate change on plants, on kind of animals, and on people. Jennifer's a Y1 kind of rated academic. For those who are not familiar with the rating system, I think what you can safely conclude from the Y1 is that she's both kind of young and a top researcher. So you're going to have a lecture, kind of a lecture today by someone who is kind of already influencing the field in really important ways, but it's someone who's going to kind of shape this field for a long time, and it's kind of my kind of great pleasure that kind of Jennifer agreed to do this lecture, kind of in a real honor for us that she can use this platform to share her work. She's going to kind of to talk about kind of tangible fingerprints of kind of the 1.1 degree kind of global warming. And as a kind of non-expert in that specific area, here's what I think kind of Jennifer's going to be saying to us. So we all hear in the kind of conversations that we have about climate change that kind of temperatures are going up, that we have kind of a lot more kind of adverse kind of events in the weather system. But I think as kind of Jennifer will show you, those are not the best places for us kind of to look for the best tangible impacts of climate change. Because as human beings, we don't feel minor changes in temperatures on an everyday basis. And while all of the IPCC reports make quite clear that those temperature temperature changes are happening, when it goes up from it comes 30 degrees to 31, or from 41 to 42 degrees, we don't sort of really have the tools to kind really understand those changes. And it's really elsewhere in the plant, in the animal, and in the human systems that we should look for the evidence of climate change. And I think she's going to take us on a journey to kind of show us kind of where we should be looking. And so, Jennifer, I look forward to the journey, and let you then pass it on to you to deliver the lecture. We'll then have a Q&A session. We have quite a kind of large group online to make the seminar interesting for everyone, and to allow everyone to share their views. I think how we'd like to do the Q&A after the lecture is to take questions from inside the room, but we're also able to unmute anyone that was online who would actually like to ask their question instead of using the chat. If you of course prefer to use the chat, we'll find a way to get those questions to Jennifer. But I just want to emphasize that both those inside the room and those kind of online kind of have the right to be heard. So we will unmute you if you have a question. So with that, over to you, Jen.
Thank you very much, Imran, and to Julia and Sonia for all of the organizing. I have attended most, if not all, of the Pro-VC seminar series since it started, and it's been incredible to see the breadth of the work that is being conducted within WITS on climate change, but also, as Imran had said, work that's being conducted internationally, but also outside of the academic sphere. I remember very clearly a fantastic Pro-VC seminar talk on litigation for loss and damage. So what I'm going to be talking about today is tangible fingerprints of the 1.1 degree post-industrial warming. And as per the introduction, I work in the field of biometeorology. I've got a group of my biometeorologists sitting right in the middle here. And it's a growing field, both globally, but also within Africa and South Africa. And at the last International Congress of Biometeorology that took place in Tempe, Arizona last year, for the first time ever, Africa represented the largest proportion of the students and new professionals group. And of that, a vast majority were from WITS University. And we are now represented on the students and new professionals group by Oriel Prinsloo, who's one of our PhD students and the course convener of Climate Change and Me. So it's really wonderful to be able to share the work that we're doing in the space of biometeorology. And hopefully through this talk, you'll get an understanding of the various different dimensions that we cover within this field. A bit of a delay on slide progression. So as Imran had said, when the IPCC sixth assessment report came out, one of the most stark findings was that we're no longer talking about a 1 degree post-industrial warming, but we're talking about a 1.1 degree post-industrial warming. What that means is that if we were to compare the temperatures between the period 1850 and 1900 to those temperatures between 2011 and 2020, the difference in temperature, or the difference in average temperatures, is 1.1 degrees Celsius. And because of the timing of that, but also because of a number of attribution studies that have been conducted, we can link that directly to the impacts of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emission, and therefore term this an anthropogenic warming. And the IPCC has gone on to show that for every increment of global warming, whether we're talking individual degrees or component degrees, decimal degrees, there are significant changes both in terms of the global distribution of air temperature and how hot it is in this room and in the city, but also the knock-on effects that that's going to have in terms of everything else on our planet. The amount of moisture that's contained in our soil, the amount of precipitation that we experience and when we experience that precipitation, the winds that we're experiencing, how fast they are and what direction they're blowing in. So that 1.1 degrees is already sitting along the thermometer that you see at the top of the screen. And the projections for the rest of the century take us through to a world at a global average 1.5 degrees, which we've now reached over this past year already. We are in an El Nino, so it is warmer than usual, but we have hit 1.5. A world at 2 degrees, a world at 3 degrees, and a world at 4 degrees. And work that Professor Francois Engelbrecht from the Wits Global Change Institute has done has demonstrated convincingly that here in Southern Africa and the African continent as a whole, we're experiencing levels of climate change that are 1.5 to 2 degrees warmer than the global average. So if we're talking about a global world at 4 degrees warmer than present, we're talking about a South African world and a sub-Saharan African world that could be as much as 8 degrees warmer than present. And so that's a scary thing to think about when we're talking about wide-scale changes and when we're looking at the types of figures on the screen in front of us. But on a day-to-day basis, we aren't looking at these figures, and we're not thinking about the end of the century. So what is 1.1 degrees Celsius? And I looked through a number of different metrics today to think this through a bit. If we look at the average diurnal temperature range of Johannesburg, so that is the difference between our daytime and our nighttime temperatures, right the way from summer through to winter and back into summer, our average diurnal temperature range is 12.4 degrees Celsius. And so 1.1 degrees is only 8.8% of that diurnal temperature range. So we can feel that it is colder at night and that it's hotter in the day. But are we feeling 8.8% of that? If we look at the average seasonal temperature range across South Africa as a whole, that's estimated at 11.13 degrees Celsius. And so 1.1 degrees in terms of that would be 9.9%. Again, we can feel the difference between being in summer and being in winter, but can we feel 9.9% of that? If we look at the difference between tomorrow and Sunday's forecasted high in Johannesburg, it's a 10-degree difference. And so again, that's about 11%. This morning, I was in Bernard Price Building where my office is based, and I used my Kestrel 5000 to take a high accuracy reading in my office and a high accuracy reading outside Bernard Price Building. The difference in temperatures was 3.8 degrees. And so 28.9% is represented by that 1.1. And yes, I could feel that it was a bit colder outside and a bit warmer inside, but not enough to put on a jacket when I went outside today. One of my students, Kaylee Rains, did a study last year looking at the impacts of heat stress on school sports. And she did a number of readings across different types of sporting surfaces. And one of the things that she did was to look at AstroTurf, because that's becoming one of the most common surfaces for school sports. Just the process of wetting AstroTurf with a hose pipe changes the temperature of the air above that AstroTurf by 20 degrees Celsius. And so 1.1 degrees is 5.5% of that. Many of us now have cars where we turn them on and they tell us what the temperature is on that day. The error margin of a car's thermometer, and obviously it differs between brands of cars, is 10%. So if we're talking about the majority of these measures falling below 10%, and the error margin on our cars is 10%, can we really detect 1.1 degrees warming? And that's something that we actually went and explored. So as part of what started off as a concept project and then expanded into a very large-scale project across South Africa, part of that was doing a very simple task of going up to people and saying, what do you think the temperature is right now? Writing down their answer and then measuring it off a high-accuracy device. And as you can see on the screen, there is a relationship between perceived temperature and actual temperature. We've got a really nice regression line there. But on the other side of the screen, we can see the true deviation. And although as true temperature increases, perceived temperature increases, we have people on both sides of the scale who are more than 8 degrees wrong in their perception of temperature. So that's people who think it's 8 degrees colder than it is right now, or people who think that it's 8 degrees hotter than it is right now. Of 984 respondents, only 1.1% were exact. 19.2%, so less than a fifth of the sample, were within 1 degree Celsius. Now, you might say that that's because air temperature is not truly what we as humans feel, and you'd be correct. The human body experiences temperature as a combination of air temperature and the relative humidity. And that creates the perceived temperature that influences our rate of sweating, our level of action that we're going to take part in, and our risk ultimately of heat stress. What's curious here is that when we compare perceived temperature to measured effective temperature, where we take into account the effects of humidity, it's an even weaker relationship. And the over bias is much higher for 8 degrees or more. So from this work, we can argue that humans cannot, or at least 80% of humans cannot detect 1.1 degrees difference in temperature. We don't even know what the temperature is right now. Now, this is really interesting because it feeds into a lot of the ways in which we measure biometeorology. A lot of people propose the best possible approach is to base our models on questionnaire outputs. And we challenge that. Well, I challenge that, and many members of my lab challenge that, and we as the BITS Biometeorology Collective are now challenging that. Because if you can't go to a person and get a correct answer on what the temperature is, how can they tell you that for them the comfort level is 20 to 24 degrees? If they're out by 8 degrees on their perception, they're out by 8 degrees in terms of their perceived limits. But then, does 1.1 degrees really matter? If we can't feel it, and if we aren't able to perceive it, and if our car is not even able to register an accurate reading within that realm, why does it matter so much? This takes me to a very different field of the research I do, which is looking at how we can understand past climates. And in this particular figure, we're looking at how climates have changed over the past 11,000 odd years, the period that we term the Holocene. Now, the Holocene is a very stable period. It's an interglacial period, so it's a period that is warmer, interrupting glacial maximums or ice ages. And so you'll see right at the beginning of the record, we see a stark increase in temperatures as we move out of what was called the cold Younger Dryas event, which really marked the last point of deglaciation after the last ice age. So if we look through the Holocene, the average temperatures of the Earth were sitting at about 15 degrees. And the pronounced events that took place, the Holocene climatic optimum, the medieval warm period, the 8.2 cold events, the neoglacial cool events, and the little ice age, were really quite considerable deviations from that average. But look at the axis here. Those are deviations of less than 1 degree Celsius. Those are deviations that sat within a margin of error of about 0.4 to 1. And yet they were enough to freeze over the Thames. There are a number of artworks such as this depicting London during the Little Ice Age. We're at a period there where there is record keeping, there are diaries, and we have good understanding of what the world looked like at that point in time. 1 degree was enough to change the way in which people had to produce agriculture, the access to food, and the functioning of economies that had been established. 1.1 degrees is also potentially what we are arguing may have been the cause for the disappearance of a lake up in the highlands of Lesotho. On the screen in front of you now is work that I've been doing with Professor Anson Mackay from University College London, looking at a diatomite core that we've extracted from Mafadi Summit. Mafadi is the highest peak in South Africa and the third highest peak in Lesotho. What we see from this diatomite outcrop, and the outcrop itself is very interesting because we wouldn't expect to see a huge amount of algae on the slope of a mountain. But it shows us that not only was there a lot of algae, but that algae was dominated by deep water species. And so the only way that we could have an accumulation of algae that is representative of deep water conditions is if that algae was underwater. And if we look at the topography of the site, the two maps that you're seeing in front of you are indicative of our topographic position index and of the actual topography. Both of them are showing the feasibility that there was a lake within that space. But that lake is not there today. Our records show that that lake likely persisted for 8,000 years and disappeared within the last 300. So that lake disappeared in the same post-industrial period that the IPCC is so interested in. Now, up in the Lesotho Highlands, there are some more complicated factors. Within the same time period, there was a large expansion in terms of the grazing area. And so a large number of sheep have moved up into the Mufadi area. Those sheep would not only have consumed water, but would also have trampled the land and changed the processes of erosion. But 1.1 degrees is enough to make an entire lake disappear. But for most of us, we are not going to go hiking or helicoptering, in my case, up to Mufadi summit in search of a lake that's disappeared. And we're very unlikely to stumble upon these types of changes that occurred during the Little Ice Age from historical records. For the average person on the street, we need a more tangible fingerprint of climate change. This brings me to a paper in Nature in 2003, published by Camille Parmesan and Gary Yohn, termed a globally coherent fingerprint of climate change impacts across natural systems. In this paper, they present a globally coherent fingerprint of climate change from phenological events. This refers to annually recurrent biological events, everything from the appearance of blossoms in spring to the orange coloration of our leaves in autumn, the emergence of our birds as they're migrating. And if we look right the way across amphibians, birds, butterflies, herbs and grasses, shrubs, trees, flies, fish, and mammals, for the vast majority, we're seeing an advance. As our temperatures are getting warmer, our springs are occurring earlier. Because if you are a plant or a butterfly or a bird, you don't have a calendar. You're determining the onset of spring by that change in temperature, the accumulation of heat, the first rainfall. But they detected this, and although supposedly global, it was, of course, very Northern Hemisphere dominated, and it relied heavily on the phenological gardens that had been established across Europe, the records of the Japanese cherry blossoms from Japan, and the naturalist records from the United States. And this caught my attention back when I was a master's student. And for my master's, I looked at the flowering dates of 5 different types of citrus in Iran. It is quite a time to be saying that I did research in Iran. And so, of course, it wasn't in Iran. It was based on historical records. And those are incredibly important for climate scientists because it broadens our horizons beyond geopolitics and the types of geopolitical issues that face us. What we found was that there was considerable coherence between the different types of citrus, but that each city had quite a different fingerprint in terms of what climate change over a period of 60 years was revealing. So much so that the city Gorgan, located in the north of Iran, just off the Caspian Sea, was actually experiencing a delay in the timing of flowering, whereas the other 2 cities were observing in advance. From this, I was also able to explore the impact that frost might have, because we cannot have our flowers appearing earlier forever without there being some kind of other risk. And what's interesting is that in a warming world, we do still get frost, and the timing of frost changes hasn't advanced as quickly as the timing of flowering events. And so this puts these flowers at greater and greater risk of coming in contact with frost. So this very complex graph, and I blame the reviewers of this paper because they wanted 5 graphs to appear in one, something my sister knows very well from her own experiences recently. Every dot is a type of citrus affected, and every number above it is the number of times in which frost had occurred after flowering already in the record. And projecting that forward, we would see an increased number of frost events affecting the citrus trees in the near decades. So I did that for my master's. I then went and climbed mountains in Lesotho and collected pollen and algae and looked under microscopes for a long time. And eventually, when I was able to broaden my research, when I was in a permanent post, I came back to a question that had bugged me for a long time. And I'm very glad that my 93-year-old gran is in the audience because I'll blame her. How many of you have heard your parents or your grandparents say that if jacarandas start flowering and you haven't started studying for exams, it's too late? Or if a jacaranda flower falls on your head, you will do well in an exam. I was staying with my grandmother when I was in, I think, grade 4. We were in the process of moving house and it was in the middle of November. And grade 4 is the first time that you write exams. And that was what I was told. So imagine my confusion when I'm really paying attention to technology. And I noticed that the jacarandas are actually blossoming on campus in September. Now, I'm sure we would all love to encourage our students to start studying for their November exams in September, and it probably would bring them immense luck if a jacaranda petal did fall on their head in September, because they're clearly in the right place at the right time. But perhaps this tells us a similar story. Now, in Iran, there were government-established citrus farms where the daily records of flowering were very carefully recorded. We don't have that here. I had about 4 years of students who were very diligently capturing the first flowering date of jacarandas. Then we had Christmas fall, then we had COVID. So we just don't have that kind of record keeping, and we needed to be more creative. So zooming into the Gauteng city region, and I'm using the GCRO's very broad definition here, we looked at whether there is an observable phenological advance in the timing of jacaranda flowering using a range of archival reporting sources. And so combining the records from the Rand Daily Mail, every time an article mentioned jacaranda, we read and recorded the article. Very often in the 1930s in the Rand Daily Mail, people used jacaranda as the term for a color, and it was popular in the 1930s. But we read through all of those and we were able to compile a list of true records or reports of the flowering of jacarandas. We were then able to supplement this with information from Die Beeld, the Star, the Wits Vuvuzela, photo records that people had sent in where they'd written the date on the back of the photograph, as well as the initial primary work that one of my honors students, Andile Fani, had done, where he went into the basement of William Cullen Library and looked through physical hard copies of the Star from the early 1900s. And using this, we've got a very similar picture to what we saw in Iran for the citrus, and what Parmesan and Yo have shown across 203 species globally. That we've got an advance here in the flowering time of jacarandas that averages to 2.1 days per decade. So over the past century, that's an average of 21 days, almost a month. And of course, it also has extremes. We have our years of very late flowering, and those occurred more often right at the beginning of the century, and our years of very early flowering, which we're experiencing more and more often in recent years. We did the same thing for the Namaqualand daisies, working with my master's student, Pascal Sneeman. We looked through many of the same sources, the Rand Daily Mail. We went to the Media 24 offices and we went through all of their records. They've digitized their own news reporting. And here, records were even more specific. We were able to divide into 3 of the distinct phenological phases of flowering: first flowering, peak flowering, and the final bloom of flowering. And again, we can see this advance occurring at rates from about 2.1 to 2.6 days per decade. The Namaqualand daisies are a natural phenomenon and a very large tourism asset for the West Coast. And again, these can't happen indefinitely without coming into the risk of frost or having a mismatch when it comes to their pollinators. Which then brings us to the butterflies. And this is probably the piece of my work that Francois Engelbrecht has been most excited about, because he is an amateur, or I wouldn't even call him an amateur. If you take a walk with him through the New Liberty Gardens, he can identify every possible butterfly. But this is work that we did looking at what's called the brown-veined white butterflies. And for any of you who are based in Johannesburg, you will notice that at some point around December and January, there is suddenly so many white butterflies in the sky that it looks like litter. It looks like little pieces of paper. And that is the large migration of these brown-veined white butterflies. They migrate from the Karoo-Kalahari region right the way up through Johannesburg, through to Klerksdorp, and make their way towards Mozambique. What they do after that is a big question, and one that we can't yet answer. But they are migrating, and they move through our city very often. So working together with one of my honors students, Antonia Pandazis, and one of my master's students, Subhashini Pillay, who's working on the e-science masters, Again, we were able to bring together a number of different records, everything from historical newspaper records through to mining Twitter and Instagram and using web scraping. And again, we see this advance, in this case, 2.9 days per decade. And we've seen a shift from large numbers of reports in February to personal observations of these butterflies in December. The same thing happens to our migrating sardines. For anyone who has spent time along the KZN coast, you'll know that the sardine run is both a big tourism event, but also a very big fishing event along KZN. And this is because large numbers of young sardines move off the Agulhas Bank and move northwards up along the coast. And if they're close enough to the coast, again, this is worth reporting. And you'll notice that this is our densest figure in terms of the amount of reporting that we've had. So this is a series of records that Heinrich Portwig put together under the supervision of Stefan Grab, and I came on board to assist with the statistical analysis and putting it together. And we're going to come back to why this graph looks a little bit different to the others. It's not just the number of points, but there's something a bit different. But before then, let's talk about why they're being reported. These phenological studies have an intricate relationship with the public and public awareness of the environment around them. The data that we've been using here in South Africa are generated precisely because the public are aware of phenology, even if they don't know the word of it. They're aware of Jacarandas flowering, and many people are aware of the fact that blossoms are appearing earlier and earlier, and that we're seeing blossoms in the middle of July. These phenological research outputs, in turn, have captured public awareness and have been very widely reported and read. And indeed, Professor Lynn Morris likes to state this particular statistic, that the most read article of the year during the time of COVID-19 vaccine development and beating Professor Shabir Mahdi was on the Jacarandas. It was the piece in the conversation that was reporting on our paper on the advance in Jacaranda flowering dates. And so we'd argue that these shifts represent a tangible and a very observable measure of the impact of 1.1 degree post-industrial warming that anyone is able to see, to understand, and to really feel. They're not going to feel 1.1 degrees, but they are going to notice year on year that the Jacarandas are appearing earlier. And so over the last 2 decades or so, there has been a large increase in phenological research in Southern Africa, and we are now able to put together the first Parmesan and Yo type fingerprint graph here in South Africa. And this is work that's just been accepted for a book on phenology, where for the first time there's an African chapter. And I'm coming back now to the sardines, because for those of you who have a background in statistics, you'd notice that the trend went the opposite direction to everything else. Where all of the rest of our phenological indicators were advancing, the sardines are delayed. And the reason for this is because the sardines migrate when it is cool enough to do so. So they wait until winter to be able to make that move up the very, very warm coast of South Africa, where the Agulhas current is bringing down very, very warm temperatures. And so plotting out the sea surface temperature isotherms, so we're looking at bands of equal temperature in terms of the sea surface, top 30 centimeters of the sea. We can see that through time, the 21 degree isotherm, so the most equatorward point at which we experience 21 degrees, is moving further and further polewards. As our oceans are getting warmer, it's harder and harder to come by 21 degrees Celsius, and you have to wait later and later for it to happen. And what sparked my interest in these isotherms and why I brought this into the paper was work that I'd previously done on tropical cyclones, because we have just as much interest in our sea surface temperatures when it comes to the formation of tropical cyclones. They require temperatures of between 26 and 27 degrees Celsius to form. Although, as my student Michael Pillay has found, and I'll speak to a bit more, here in Southern Africa, they might actually be substantially lower. And again, we can see that over time, there has been a poleward migration in the 26 and the 27 degree sea surface temperature isotherm. And that for the 27 degree isotherm, the point at which it is very easy for tropical cyclones to form, the poleward trajectory has been far more rapid. And this means that tropical cyclones like Beira are far more probable than before. Interestingly, there's actually been a reduction in the total number of tropical cyclones, particularly in the South Indian Ocean, and that's because other conditions for formation, including vertical shear, have also been changing. So less storms are forming, but the storms that do form are becoming stronger and stronger. And so we're more likely to get Category 3, Category 4 tropical cyclones, which is what what Cyclone Idai was. But we're also starting to see a change in the track that these storms are following. If we look at the bottom figure, you can see a number of arrows. And there is a 13.5% arrow that tracks to the south of Madagascar and makes landfall in southern Africa. And here we come to the work of one of my brilliant students, Michael Pillay, who, for his honors project, did a study on all of the tropical cyclones that existed south of the Tropic of Capricorn. So extratropical cyclones, but storms that had the correct morphology, behavior, and impact as a tropical cyclone. And he categorized each of these storms to look at why they took the path they took and what their impacts were. And so we have to be concerned about the fact that we are getting tropical cyclones outside of the tropics. Their area of impact is expanding forwards. But we're also getting the emergence of Category 5 tropical cyclones. Idai made landfall at Category 3. And I think most of us here in Southern Africa are aware of the impacts of Cyclone Idai. In the South Indian Ocean, we did not have any record of any Category 5 tropical cyclones until 1994. Now, we may argue that if we're looking at North America, where the earliest Category 5 tropical cyclone recorded is 1924, that they had much better monitoring. And sure, they did. But from the 1970s, tropical cyclones have been monitored from remote sensing. And there is confidence that they've picked up almost every storm. From 1989, we've had geostationary remote sensing of this region of the ocean. And so we can say with confidence that they are a recent emergence. We did not have Category 5 level, super intense category tropical cyclones before. But also, if you look at the list of all of those storms, and this list curtails at about 2016, which is when this paper was submitted, we're getting an increasing number, and in fact, an accelerating number of Category 5 tropical cyclones forming. So for Michael's master's, he took things a step further, and he did extensive analysis on what happens across the Southern Hemisphere as a whole. Now, I think there have only been 2 tropical cyclones in the South Atlantic, so we can largely ignore that ocean basin. But if we look at the rest of them, we can see these hotspots where tropical cyclones are forming and where they're intensifying. And we can start to see patterns in terms of these storms and how they're changing. Michael then went on to critique the original conditions of formation. So for anyone who's done high school geography, I'm sure for your final matric exam, you had to learn Gray's 1975 conditions of formation for tropical cyclones. And you had to list off those 8 bullet points: your sea surface temperature above 26.5 degrees and your low vertical shear, and so it went. We actually tested those. We said, what is the lowest criteria under which tropical cyclones can form in the Southern Hemisphere? And temperatures can be considerably lower than that. Our wind speeds, our vertical shear, everything that we've taken as a given needs to come into question. And to re-monitor tropical cyclones locally to get a better understanding of why they're forming, where they're forming, and the types of trajectories that they're following. The big challenge, though, when we're living in this world where people are grappling to find a 1.1 degree warming signal, is that journalists come into play, they interview people who claim expertise, and the picture can get very muddied. So this is a report that is very accurate. It speaks to how climate change made extreme rains in the 2022 South Africa floods in Durban twice as likely. And here at the Wits Global Change Institute, Francois Engelbrecht has found very similar results himself from attribution modeling. But around the same time of the Durban floods, I was quite horrified to see a news interview where somebody without any climatological background was speaking in response to the Durban floods, a feature of a tropical cut-off low system, speaking about the floods in relation to Hurricane Katrina and how we need to make bridges more rigid. Now, I'm not aware of any papers that say we want bridges to be more rigid. We want them to be more flexible. We want to include venting. But more importantly, we're not talking about Hurricane Katrina. We're talking about a local system That is very common. We have a number of cut flow systems that affect South Africa each year. And of course, they change when we move into and out of El Nino and La Nina periods. But to have people who come from outside of the field reporting on the news and creating misinformation has serious impacts. And so actually prior to me seeing that particular interview and getting very angry, my student Keegan Fraser and I had a look at misinformation and instant access in the case of Cyclone Idai. So when we're looking at a tropical cyclone, we've got very accurate information that is shared every 6 hours by global meteorological services. And so if you know where to look, you're able to track a storm quite easily. But even with that level of access, and even with the school curriculum covering tropical cyclones far more extensively than it does cut and flow systems, there was a number of variations in terms of what was reported. So among the things that we looked at were the date of the article versus the number of reported deaths and how that changed through time. Now, of course, as we go further on in time, we become more and more accurate. But that period of instant access to information where the news is able to sell, what kind of accuracy do we have? Another thing that Keegan looked at was the reported wind speeds. And here we had even greater variation in those first couple of hours to days. And so we argued in this paper that there needs to be a balance between getting information out and getting accurate information out. And part of that is being able to tap into very highly skilled scientists who are able to then communicate their knowledge, who have the time to communicate their knowledge, and who can do so in an easy to understand way. And of course, those scientists all have jobs, and it is difficult to do that. But it becomes important that if we're going to use an expert, that it is an expert in the correct field, and that otherwise we don't try and rely on expertise. Around the same time, one of my PhD students, William, was in Zimbabwe doing all of the field work for his PhD. And while he was near Big Falls, a report came out internationally saying that Victoria Falls has dried up completely. William was right there. And so we asked him to drive 2 hours and to go and see how dry it is, because this is what the global news was showing. William found that this was completely normal for that section of the mountain that they photographed. And he'd seen that many, many times, having grown up in Zimbabwe. But the actual waterfall was still flowing. The river at the bottom of the waterfall was still flowing, and the rivers leading into the waterfall were still flowing. And the problem here is that if you're going to report that Victoria Falls is dried up, there's a very good chance, particularly in early December, that you're going to have a massive impact on a tourism sector that is already incredibly vulnerable. Because people are flying in from faraway destinations, specifically to see the waterfalls, are still within the window with which they can cancel or change their plans. And to do so on misinformation is a very serious problem. And so within, I think, 1 year, we put out 2 papers where we looked at these specific case studies of misinformation, of the challenges of climate information being put out with the idea of trying to gain public awareness, but simultaneously over-dramatizing the impacts of this 1.1 degrees. And unfortunately, when people find it is misinformation, they lose faith in climate scientists and they lose faith in that 1.1 degrees. When they find out that Victoria Falls is still flowing, that the Durban floods were not Katrina, and when they find out that there is significant misinformation about the impacts of Idai, when we try to tell people about that more negligible 1.1 degrees and the huge impacts that that can have, the story becomes difficult to follow. So, to conclude, as we've proven by asking people what the temperature is, the 1.1 degree post-industrial warming is not easily tangible to humans, to our skin, to our metabolisms. It does, however, have significant impacts on our climate systems, our ecosystems, and our hydrological systems. And because we all see the world around us and we enjoy taking breaks to go for walks in nature, we like to look out our windows, and many of us are keen on gardening, phenology is perhaps the most tangible fingerprint of these progressive increases in temperature, and in many cases, the best recorded. Social media has now heightened the awareness of phenology, particularly through photo competitions. For those of you on Instagram, there is a Jacaranda in my pocket and now a cosmos in my pocket. And I'm currently doing work with Dr. JJ Gregory at UP to look at how we can view climate change and phenological shifts through the lens, pun intended, of Instagram. But we also need to be cognizant of the importance of accurate reporting, that in the era in which people can share information instantly to vast audiences, where TikTok videos go viral within 5 minutes, that we need to be cautious about our own level of understanding and the accuracy of our interpretations before sharing them with a broader audience. Thank you.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Jen. That was the most amazing journey, and thank you for taking us all on that journey. So I'm going to immediately open it up for any questions, any suggestions or thoughts anyone wants to share. I think we'll start in the room, and Julia's going to help me with those who are online. So I see Ariel's hand. Let's start with you, Ariel.
That was great. Thank you very much. I am biased because I am a part of your lab. But I just wanted to ask, and maybe you could just comment on that, I'm sure there's many aspects of credibility to it, but then what is the credibility of using questionnaire data and perception data from human beings who are feeling things now? Yeah, thanks.
Can I respond to that? Thanks, Ariel. So it depends on what you're using questionnaire data for. And in the context of biometeorology, there has been a huge push in terms of developing indices where we can plug in easily available climate data and get out the other end of it a level of heat stress or a risk of being hospitalized for cardiovascular issues or the climatic suitability of a destination. And that's where I question how useful perception-based ranges of temperature are. We can ask somebody when they think the start of the flu season is. And as Palesa is interrogating for her honors, there's a wide variation even if you ask amongst the medical community. That doesn't mean that there is a wide variation in terms of when the flu season begins. And so questionnaire data and indeed interview data as well has a place. It absolutely does, whether that's more broadly or specific to biometeorology. But we need to be cautious about the questions we're asking. We need to think carefully about how we're asking those questions. And then we need to think about how we can triangulate and validate that data. So in the case of biometeorological indices, a lot of what we've been doing is saying, are we asking a leading question by making people think about the weather? What if we look at TripAdvisor? What if we look at reports that people are writing without being asked to speak about weather at all? What happens if we look purely at arrivals data? What happens if we were to use any other kind of proxies, such as bookings numbers? And I think as long as you're able to triangulate your data and you're thinking carefully about how you're posing questions, it can be valuable. But as you're well aware, because this comes into your PhD as well, we are pushing back against this narrative that an index is flawed purely because it hasn't been tested against questionnaire data, if that questionnaire data is inherently problematic itself.
Great, Jen. Thank you. I'm just checking in the room if there's any more questions. Okay, we have 2 more, so let's start at the back, and then perhaps Jen, we can in this round we can take 2 questions, so we'll come next to Estelle.
Hi. You mentioned that tropical cyclones tend to move away from the tropics as the temperature increases. So could that be a reason why Devon recently is experiencing extensive floods or extreme temperatures?
Over to you, Estelle.
Yeah, sorry, not a question, but just to say how incredibly amazing your work is. I'm really impressed with the scope and the variety, and I'm so pleased that I was here. And there's an Artists in Labs program that I think you should I think an artist the Wits Innovation Center is organizing it. And they had an artist in Andrew Forbes's lab. And the idea is that the artists can bring new insights to what you do. And it sounds to me as if you would be an incredibly fruitful lab for an artist to collaborate with you. Yeah.
Back to you, Jen.
I'll start with a still. Thank you. What's really interesting, so we try and hold a lab workshop at least once a year, just to bring everyone together. And part of that is presenting our research. But this past year in November, we also did a paint your project. And so more than just the diversity of the work we do, I also think that we're a collection of scientists who'd be very excited to collaborate with a project like that. We had some incredible paintings, and from people who say they can't paint, what we got at the end of that day was amazing. And some of it was we had a session for painting, and then people could continue to do it, listening to each other's presentations. And it was stunning. And I'm seeing all of my new students looking very jealous because they weren't yet part of it. In response to the question about tropical cyclones, so yes, Durban has recently had a tropical cyclone make passage over the, well, not Durban, but KZN has had a tropical cyclone make passage over the northern regions. That is not yet an unusual phenomenon. So we do get tropical cyclones that make landfall into the northern regions of KZN every once in a while. Part of that is particularly if we have very warm eddies moving down through the Mozambique Channel, it encourages storms to linger in the channel a bit longer or to make a passage further south. So that's not unusual, but it is what we are likely to experience more and more of. So in KZN, we are very well protected by Madagascar, provided that storms move directly across the ocean and then make landfall, moving over Madagascar, losing strength and making landfall either in Mozambique or Southern Africa or South Africa. But if we are seeing more and more tropical cyclones migrating south of Madagascar, that puts KZN at much greater risk. Part of that, though, is a wait and see. There's a lot of modeling efforts that are being done, but in addition to the increase in sea surface temperature, as we move further and further south, we've got a strengthening Coriolis effect, but we've also often got an increase in our vertical shear. And so that would literally pull storms apart. So it's really interesting to watch what's been happening over the last 5 years or so. And it's one of the reasons why projections forward are usually coupled with historical analyses backwards. And my work on the Category 5 tropical cyclones and their poleward trajectory, I'm very fortunate that that's been included in the most recent IPCC report and speaking to their influence in terms of bringing in historical records and giving value to that.
Great. So let's kind of shift online. Kind of Tabani, who's online, has his hand up, and I'm going to ask Julia to please unmute him so we can hear his question. So kind of over to you then, Tabani.
Thank you very much, Prof. And thanks, Prof. Jennifer, for the presentation. It's a great presentation. I'm a public servant. I work in the climate change management space as a practitioner. And I'm always interested in the science, stroke policy, stroke implementation kind of cycle. In terms of the work you have done, which is great work, how can the work that you have done and continue to do in the lab inform policy? If it is currently informing policy, if it is not, how do you plan to ensure that the work that you do eventually find its way in some way or another to the level of policy making and implementation? Let me say that. Policy making and implementation, because oftentimes we need to make a case about the impact of climate change on exacerbating the occurrence of severe weather phenomena such as thunderstorms and floods, etc. Because KZN, for example, where I'm based in Pietermaritzburg, I'm based in KZN, working in KZN. somebody will say KZN has a history of floods, but we talk about two things in the context of climate change. One is intensity and frequency. So we need to make a case even to those that make policy to say, you know what, because of climate change, we are seeing a trend in terms of increase in frequency and intensity of these severe weather phenomena. And as researchers play a pivotal role in the whole discourse because you provide scientific information. I'm a practitioner. I don't generate scientific knowledge as a researcher, and researchers are quite important in the chain of events. And the work that you are doing, it's first time I'm exposed to this work, and I'm quite fascinated by the great work that you are doing. And we wouldn't want such great work to, gather dust in shelf number 13, but we want it to find way into policy and into implementation. So that's essentially my comment stroke question to say we need to ensure that the work that is being done by researchers and scientists find expression at the level of policy making and implementation. Thank you, Prof. Thank you very much.
Right, over to you, Jen. I think perhaps, especially for the online folk, it might be easier for us to do a question and you respond, so that we don't break the flow between the question and your answer. So back to you, Jen.
That would also help my concentration span at this point today. Thank you so much. Very, very important point. And it's something that we have been very critically reflecting on. There are a number of ways in which to channel scientific information to the public and to direct policy. And one of those is science communication. And it's something that our lab is very passionate about, is being able to communicate very dense academic papers full of statistics and terminology that is not very accessible into something that can be read by the general public. So that's the one direction. The other direction has been in trying to engage directly with local municipalities, for example, and often that is on an invite basis, and where feasible and where there is capacity, it is something that we certainly do. So engaging with, for example, KZN as a province, City of Joburg as a municipality, we've had quite a bit of engagement. And then the other thing is that there is an increase in corporate interest in what's happening with climate change, and those corporate interests can often drive policy with quite a strong arm, and whether that's good or bad, we can park for another discussion. But for example, the insurance sector is becoming very worried about climate change and very worried about their level of knowledge of climate change. And so it's also being able to engage with them through those platforms. And then finally, as a university, that we are teaching students, and large cohorts of them right the way from first year through to PhD students. And each of them then have the capacity to communicate further as well. So one of the students who graduated in December is now working at City of Cape Town. And I'm halfway through a voice message from her with an update on how things are going. So it's a combination of all of those different factors. That is not enough. And I think we need to have much faster and larger scale communication and influence in terms of policy development. And I think it's also something that academia needs to value in a more significant manner, because it's difficult to squeeze it into the 8 to 5 that we're trying to work with all of our other duties.
Great, Jen. So let's stick online. Our next person online is Nazirus Salisu. And I'm going to ask Julia to just unmute. Okay, over to you.
Hello, thank you, Prof, for the wonderful presentation. I'm Naziru Salisu from Nigeria. So, Prof, I'm really interested with what you have presented now, because I currently working on a proposal titled "Infer of Climate Change on Phenology in Semi-Arid Region, Northwestern Nigeria." So, although I never work on phenology, this is the first time I become interested and I start drafting a proposal on it. So there are many things that I wanted to ask so that I will know if I'm working on the right track. Although I consulted many literatures in which they guided me in writing this proposal. The question is that, Prof, what is the best method that can help me to trace the historical phenological changes? And what is the best method that can also help me to understand the current phenological changes of a particular trees? Because we observe in this area, there is high reduction in productions of fruit trees. So this is what attract us in developing this proposal. So I want to know what are the best methods that can be used in studying the historical changes as well as the current phenological changes. Thank you.
That sounds like a very exciting proposal. And I will also let you know that if you have preliminary work from that forms part of a review of that region, we do have an open call for a special issue on African biometeorology through the International Journal of Biometeorology that you may want to consider submitting to. So my little plug for the journal there. In terms of historical phenology, it really depends on what is available in a given country. So remote sensing is probably the most easily accessible form of phenological data. We can use NDVI, for example, to detect a green wave of the onset of spring, but usually that's across multiple different species. There has been a degree of success in drilling down to individual species where you're able to do a lot of ground-based analysis in logging the location of those species. So remote sensing, both in terms of contemporary and then historical going back to the 1970s, is able to give us some evidence. Then depending on the history of newspaper reporting, obviously when there are periods of political instability, newspaper reporting tends to move away from the natural environment and towards political instability. So you can end up with some gaps there, but it's worth looking at newspaper records, finding out whether those have been digitized, and then looking for identifiable keywords that you can use to search. Then some records have been kept by people who are very passionate about plants. So those can include farmers, people who are just very interested as a hobby and who go for walks. So those kinds of records might be housed in museums. And then the last thing, and specifically to Nigeria, I worked with Eremos Ebuoma, who was doing his PhD on climate conditions in Nigeria and the use of indigenous knowledge systems. And we found that a large number of the indigenous knowledge system indicators that were used were actually phenological indicators. And so there may be a huge wealth of information through oral histories and through indigenous knowledge that could capture some of that record.
Great. I still have a few online questions, but maybe I'm going to shift to the room and see if there's a question inside the room. Over to you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Prof, for the presentation. It was quite exciting. So my not really a question, but I mean, I'm coming from a very social scientific perspective, and I'm looking at climate migration within Johannesburg and how this affects the growth of peri-urban settlements. So I know in the academic world, there is a strong focus on interdisciplinarity. So I just want to check with you, I mean, what do you think are the points of collaboration between the work you are doing and maybe those coming from the social scientific perspective and using social scientific methods in this kind of research? And secondly, I don't know if you have some suggestions on where to source data on the impact of climate change on migration of people, human beings in this aspect within the Southern African region and also specifically within the Johannesburg area. Thank you.
Thanks. So I'm based in a geography department. So we are the meeting point of the sciences and the social sciences. And here it fits very much so. We've got a number of colleagues who are working from the perspective of human geography, some of whom have backgrounds as wide-ranging as urban and regional planning, right the way through to sociology, and anthropology who are engaging with precisely these questions. So yes, absolutely, this is the melting pot where a lot of that kind of collaboration happens. My own research does have a social science slant to it, particularly when we start looking at indigenous knowledge systems and we're looking at tourism geographies, for example. So wide range of places for collaboration. And I can, for example, put you on to Professor Malala Simatele, Dr. Alex Wafer, both of whom are working in fields quite similar to yours. In terms of data, so there was a UN study, and I'm trying to remember its name and it's not coming back to me, but now Dr. Robert Freeman was involved in that, based in Johannesburg, working as part of the Southern African group. So if you look into UN studies, it would have come out about 4 years ago. And looking at climate migration, there was a Southern African wing to it that was being conducted that I'm aware of. I'd also really encourage you to engage with the GCRO. So they do a quality of life survey here in the Gauteng City Region Observatory. And it is such a wealth of data that is collected and detail in terms of how they're interpreting and analyzing that data. And you may well get some insights from them in terms of what they've been able to track already.
And let's move back kind of online. So our next online kind of question comes from Marlies Craig. Marlies, Julia's going to unmute you and you can ask your question.
Thanks very much. Thanks so much for this. This was an interesting presentation. I was just wondering if you can comment on frequency of tornadoes, or is there research looking into that? Because it seems from the Tornado Watch online records that there is also an increase, and if there's any work that's looking into this. Because that, to me, tornadoes are very visual and they communicate very clearly to the experience of people.
Yes, so tornadoes are quite significantly under-researched in Southern Africa. There is a Thank you, sorry. There is a record that's kept by the South African Weather Services of tornadoes specifically here in South Africa. Because they are very localized and relatively small scale tornadoes by comparison to what we see in the United States, they haven't attracted as much attention, but absolutely, as you're saying, we're starting to see more of them. We're seeing them in urban areas where there is the potential for quite extensive damage. And it is an area of increasing concern, particularly because they are so unpredictable. With a tropical cyclone, you have a couple of days lead time where people can watch the storm track and start to prepare and evacuate. Across in the United States, they have got the best possible forms of tornado storm prediction and the kind of infrastructure to be able to protect yourself from tornadoes. We have neither here. And so certainly it is an area that needs a lot more research attention.
All right, anyone else in the room want to ask a question? Let's go to you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for your presentation. I noticed two things this year. One is the number of ants that have increased. And I was in Polokwane over the Easter weekend. I've not seen so much ants in a very long time. And even here in Johannesburg. And then the other thing is that I noticed that I think we had a bumper crop of mangoes this year, because I just enjoyed my mango without paying too much. But in Palaboro, there was a very big problem with mangoes because of the heat. Thank you for commenting on it.
Sure, and lovely to see you again. So in terms of the ants, I have not personally noticed more ants, but I live on the 4th floor of an apartment block, so I think that's why I have been blissfully unaware of this. But in terms of both the ants and the heat and the mangoes, This has been an El Nino season. It's been a very hot El Nino summer. I think for any of us who've lived in Joburg for quite a number of years, we haven't had such an oppressively hot summer for such a long period without the interruptions of cool afternoon thunderstorms or a couple of cool days in between. So it really has been a very, very hot summer. On the mangoes, so that was my very first research I ever did, was looking at mango yields and how they were changing in the Phalaborwa region as a result of climate change. And what's really interesting for the mangoes here in South Africa is we were originally growing them in what was probably a bit too cold a climate. That Hoedspruit Phalaborwa region at that point in time wasn't really tropical. It was your subtropical becoming temperate. And as temperatures have got hotter and hotter, we've moved very quickly into very clear subtropical conditions that are then so well suitable for mangoes, for lychees, for avocados. And we're seeing those industries really blooming over the last 3 decades or so. But what's interesting with the mangoes is that for a period of about 30 years, it was both the age of the tree and the effective temperature that was massively increasing the yields, because as the trees get bigger, they're able to hold greater yields. And I think what we're reaching is a point in time where the trees aren't growing much bigger, proportional to their size and proportional to the yields that they can hold. And so the effect then is predominantly an effect of temperature. And as we get these extreme heat events, and we've had weeks on end of extremes, that then can really affect the tree because it's not feeding the growth of the tree and the production of the mangoes in the same way. So I think that's probably at play. But that's why we're getting so many of them, because we're reaching that peak condition. And then if they happen to still be on the trees, when we get a heat wave, you're going to start getting very severe effects on any of our crops. And I think Zimbabwe's really struggled with droughts this season. The impacts on crops there have really been felt. But you can go right the way down to the Western Cape, and people will be talking about the effects of an El Nino, a strong El Nino summer on our crop production across the region. And it will be different depending on what you're growing and what kind of a climate you're in, but it is detectable across just about every agricultural sector.
Great. So let's shift to online, and I understand we have a question from. We can have question. So we have a question. We have a question from. We've got a question from Linda Murray, and if it's the Linda Murray that I know, then the question will be coming from London. So kind of over to you, Linda.
Thanks so much. And thanks so much, Jennifer. Absolutely fascinating. My question is to ask you to elaborate on research that you're doing in the Global South with collaborators on plant-animal interactions and the effects of climate change outpacing evolution. So you've already mentioned the great example of the sardine run. I was thinking also of flower pollinator interactions and plants as food for animals, and some of the distressing consequences that some of the global north studies have been showing. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Linda. Linda and I go back to discussions with FITS-UCL collaborations, and some of the work that I was presenting on the lake up in Lesotho is the product of one such FITS-UCL collaboration. So great to hear from you, Linda. So in terms of plant pollinator interactions, it's a really interesting area and something that phenologists were very concerned about from about 2012 when I attended the phenology conference in Milwaukee and the subsequent 2 conferences. And I actually met Tama at a Maths and Industry Study Group workshop where we presented the mathematical challenge of trying to look at plant pollinator interactions, and where we would have a point at which, for example, your bees appear before the flowers that they need to pollinate, or you have 2 different plants that would normally cross-pollinate one another that are flowering at different times, or you have your caterpillars appearing before the leaves have emerged, and so the caterpillars are not able to feed on anything. And there was a lot of mathematical modeling that took place at that workshop in trying to figure out how to tackle that question. What's very interesting is at the last phenology conference, which was now 2 years ago, held during COVID, there's quite a substantial body of evidence that's now indicating that these mismatches may not actually be as big a problem as we'd originally thought. That the codependent species are starting to come back together. They're realizing that they are on the verge of a mismatch, and they're adapting then not only to the climate, but to the food source as well. And so there's been some really interesting work presented from everywhere from, I think, Australia through to France, through to the United States, looking at how we can reinterrogate this using much more recent observations, and that there may be a way in which there is a regrouping under a warmer climate, so that that risk of mismatch will get periods in time where the climate changes too quickly for them to catch up, but they do then seem to be catching up within a couple of years. So really interesting area of research at the moment and debate within the field.
Okay, we've put Jen through a fair amount of questions, and I think it's been yeah. So I'll take one more round in the room and then check if there's one more question online. Anyone in the room? If not, let me just check if there's anyone online. I believe we did have a question from Sharon which, if I'm right, I think Sharon wants to ask me a question. I'm going to safely pass it on to Jennifer, but let's take your question, Sharon.
Hi, thanks, Imran, and what a fantastic presentation. I had really 2 points, I think, to make about it. The one was that this issue with journalists is nothing that's unique to climate change, the problem of sensationalist reporting or inaccurate reporting. And it seemed to me to open an interesting space for departments across the university to work together. And I wonder where there is space for us to work with the Department of Journalism or the school or I've forgotten what it's called, the institute, to address this kind of issue. And then the second point, which is also about interdisciplinarity, was which you speak so wonderfully across so many disciplines, both methodologically and in terms of content. It's really fantastic, and it's the real value of interdisciplinary schools. But you clearly are an outstanding interdisciplinary researcher. But Imran, the question really was to you, is that we don't seem to create the incentives or the space within the university to do enough interdisciplinary work. And one of the things I was also thinking about your lecture is it's an absolutely fantastic model to do a day seminar with first-year students. The idea that all students should be able to engage with issues of what is evidence, what is reliability, what, you know, and whether you're coming from the social sciences or the hard sciences makes no difference. And so how do we make those kinds of things happen? The answers for the complex issues that face us are not within single disciplines. For those of us in interdisciplinary schools, we know that, but for other disciplines, they stick inside their silos. And Imran, I was wondering where we are with the compulsory single course for all first years, how the university can incentivize cross-disciplinary work and create the space and time for people to meet across disciplines. I think this lecture is obviously one example. But just fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. And how do we create the space for more interdisciplinary work? Thank you.
Right, Jen, do you want to have the first go, and then I'll go to Ariel to just kind of answer the bit about the question on the first year course, and then I'll try to respond as well.
Thanks, brilliant question. So yes, absolutely, this does require collaboration with people who are studying journalism and teaching journalism. I was very fortunate to engage extensively with Azay Patel, who's now the editor for the Environment and Climate, I think is his title. I'm probably getting it wrong. It's Mail and Guardian. While he was doing his master's through the School of Journalism. And we had a number of discussions through that time, but absolutely something that needs to be expanded quite dramatically. And part of that is precisely the compulsory first year course, because that is offered to everyone at Wits, whether you're a medical student or an engineering student or a journalism student or a law student, or you end up in our environmental science class. So I was actually very heavily involved in that from its conception, and it's been taught exclusively by my own students, which I'm very proud of. So the first year it was run by now Dr. Mauro Lourenco, and he's now working for the large-scale National Geographic project up in Angola. And for the last 2 years, it's been run by Ariel Prinsloo, who's currently finishing up her PhD with me. And it is a fantastic course to be able to communicate precisely the issues around climate change, but also how we go about assessing reliability of data, validity of assumptions, and it is a core component of that course. But also, it's one of the reasons why I continue to teach first year level. So most people, when they have been around for long enough, get rid of the first years, and they focus all of their time and attention on higher levels of study and their postgraduate students. And I certainly have a flock of them here today, but I do still teach first year, and I'm very passionate about teaching first year because I think being that first person that they encounter at the beginning of the year and teaching environmental change to between 250 and 290 people who've chosen to be in that field is really one of the biggest things I can do in terms of communicating climate change. And when I was having the existential crisis most of us had in the middle of COVID, my sister's an emergency physician, a specialist consultant at a hospital where she ran as head of department for a while. And I said to her, "You're saving lives on a daily basis through COVID. What am I doing?" And she said, "You're teaching people." And I really did take that to heart, because it's through teaching people that I think we're able to have the greatest level of impact and that we're able to engage in interdisciplinarity. And the last thing I wanted to say on this topic is that the reason I am speaking here today, I think, is very much because of the efforts that Imran has made over the last couple of years. There is a symposium that's taking place over a 2-day period for the last 2 or 3 years. And it's been an incredible space for meeting other people who are working in that field. So it was through Imran's symposium that I met Professor Tracy Lynn Fields, and she and I and Dr. Xavier Rebello, who's here, I went to his talk today on law, and it was fascinating, and I learned things I've never known before. We are running a workshop on drought that would not have come about if it weren't for these kinds of platforms and these spaces to engage with each other. So I think especially talking to colleagues from other universities, that we are very lucky here because there is such a focus on interdisciplinarity and that it really is promoted.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that. And Ariel, anything you want to say about the climate change and me course? I just do a quick. So last year there were reports in the press about the University of Barcelona kind of introducing a compulsory first year course on climate change across the university. And because I was the Pro Vice Chancellor for kind of climate change, I had easily 100 emails from people saying, look what Barcelona is doing. You really have to do the same thing. And it was really pleasing to be able to say, well, actually, we've been doing this for at least 3 years. And as far as I can tell, we're the first university in the world to have introduced a compulsory first year component on climate change. And I think Ariel's run the course for the last 2 years. Ariel, any kind of thoughts you want to share on that?
I think you both basically summed it up really well. But yeah, it's a big course. It runs in the first 2 weeks before the start of the semester. It's part of the Gateway to Success program to help students transition from being high school students to university students. And each iteration has really increased, but we're dealing with around 6,500 students. So it's massive. And although we do and have experienced some challenges in getting all students a part of it, I think it's really nice that this particular year we had actuarial students coming to the fore compared to last year, and just the general excitement of students and wanting to do more and be practical is just very telling to how proactive students want to be. So looking forward to how it progresses in future. Thanks.
We just adjudicated the top. So part of what the students have to do is to write a blog, and kind of Ariel and others adjudicated the top 20 blogs, and just looking at the range of students. So our top blog was a student was a student from health sciences who is doing a nursing degree. We had actuarial scientists, we had kind of future accountants, we had future geographers, and so on. And Sharon, just to answer your question, the kind of precise reason why the university has set up the Pro Vice Chancellor's Office is because we think we need to be promoting kind of interdisciplinary work on climate change. Because of all of the challenges that we're facing across the world, I think climate change is the one that can only be properly understood and can only be kind of properly dealt with if we bring all of our academic disciplines together to think about the problem, to work together, to seek solutions together. And I think we kind of really trying hard at Wits University to make that happen. Kind of Jen referred to our kind of annual kind of interfaculty symposium. I'm pleased to report that we kind of have the call for papers for the symposium kind of approved, and we should be sharing it across the university in the next few days. We kind of planning to extend it this year to kind of include master students, and we want to keep growing the kind of interdisciplinary spaces that we have today. So with that, let me close and thank Jen. I think that was a kind of fantastic presentation, but I think much more importantly, Jen gave us a sense of the incredible work that she's doing kind of across kind of such an interesting set of issues. What's another hallmark of it is kind of how much of that work is being done with her students, and the kind of amazing impact that she's having. So kind of Jen, not only are you showing us how to do interdisciplinary work, but I think you're also showing us the kind of amazing potential to do this work in universities, and to work with students on kind of on these. So it's been a really fantastic afternoon. Let me ask you to kind of join me to kind of express our thanks to Jen for a fantastic afternoon. For those who are here, and this is an incentive for those who are online to kind of try to attend our seminars in person. So if you're here in person, please join us for some snacks and drinks, and some time to kind of chat with Jen come to mingle and to spend some time together. So in closing, I want to again thank Jen, to thank the team in the Pro Vice Chancellor's office who make these events happen. I'm really grateful to you. We have another 3 lectures planned in the series for this year, and we have some kind of pretty influential international speakers as well. So please look out, look out for the announcements, and we kind of look forward to having you at those events. So with that, I'll close the evening. Thank you everyone for attending, and thanks again, Jen.